Hey everyone, in this video I'll be covering how to edit a bright and airy style in Adobe Lightroom. Here's a quick little before and after to show the end result we'll be going for. For those new here, my name is Nate Torres. I'm a photographer, speaker, and author, and I provide easy educational content for photographers. So editing light and airy photos in Adobe Lightroom often involves enhancing the brightness, softness, and pastel-like colors in the image to create that ethereal and dreamy look in your image. We'll be covering about 7 steps in order to get this look, so let's dive into the first one. So the first step to get that light and airy look involves the actual setting of your image. So before even diving into Lightroom, it's important to kind of understand what look you're going for, and as I mentioned, bright and airy, it's kind of that ethereal, dreamy look. So before you even head into Lightroom, the image you capture in camera should be one that's kind of bright and happy. So for example, there should be, a lot of sunlight in your image. The subject should be like smiling or have a plain neutral face. They shouldn't really be like frowning or sad or crying or anything like that. Kind of the main point behind this is you want the image itself straight out of camera, like the setting, to kind of match the mood that you're trying to edit for. So for example, if you're going for a moody look, then you'll want the image to be dark, maybe like evening time or in the morning where it's not really that bright yet. Maybe the subject's not smiling, maybe they have a neutral or like a sad face, and stuff like that. So the second step I like to dive into is adjusting the tone curve first. I love to always adjust the tone curve as the first step and then adjust the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks, and the overall exposure after adjusting the tone curve, because the tone curve can introduce such strong changes first, and then I kind of like to do the fine edits and tweaks with the other settings. So when touching into the tone curve, I like to make a basic S tone curve and then adjust it a little bit, bringing up the shadows more and the whites. And the important thing to remember with the tone curve before even diving into any edits is to really look at your histogram and understand the different parts of it. So on the right side, you have the whites, highlights, midtones, the shadows, and then the blacks. So when it comes to editing a light and airy and bright and airy photo, usually the whites and the highlights and everything will be pushed up higher, and it wouldn't be so much more in the shadows and the blacks. So as you can see here, there's more spikes in the blacks and the shadows, and it's kind of just a well exposed image. Essentially what we'll be doing is just adjusting it more. Even if you adjust the exposure up all the way right now, you can see now it's more in the highlights and the whites, and that's kind of the whole honestly, the whole theme behind bright and airy is just pushing it towards highlights and whites. And so that's just pretty easy to remember. So diving into the tone curve, let me just make my basic S curve. This is how I like to start it off. I bring the highlights down and then the blacks up. And then I add in a point here and I just raise this. I raise the whites, or I raise the highlights. I bring the whites down, I raise the highlights, and then I bump the shadows down as well. And as you can see, it's already kind of looking pretty good. So I like to bump the blacks up and then the shadows down, and then just have this basic, S tone curve. So I like to have the highlights flatten out with the whites, and then I like to have the shadows and the blacks flatten out as well. And then here's your basic S tone curve. You can tweak it, of course. This isn't every photo is different, so you'll have to tweak it and adjust it to your settings. So as you can see here, I kind of want to bring the blacks down a little bit more again, it was getting a little too faded out in terms of the blacks. So as you can see here, that looks pretty good already. I'm happy with that. Here's the before and the after. Kind of softened the image because, as I mentioned, bright and airy, it's kind of that ethereal, dreamy look. And with that also comes the softening of the image. You want to soften it a little bit and not be as harsh, in my opinion, because you're going for that dreamy look. So that's the basic tone curve. The third step I love to dive into after that is the basic adjustments. So everything on the right side top half panel here, including the exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, blacks. So this is kind of more like fine tuning I do, and adjust certain areas that I didn't really like with the kind of the blanket adjustments I did with the tone curve. So the first thing I like to dive into is just starting from, top to bottom. I adjust the overall exposure to what I like it. So in this case, the exposure, I'll be pushing it towards the right and brightening the photo because, as mentioned, right, we'll be raising the highlights and the whites, and that's kind of the whole theme behind bright and airy. So I'll just bump this up until where I like it. So as you can see, as mentioned earlier, it's kind of already becoming that bright and airy look. We don't have to really do much. So I'll just stop until I like how it looks personally. There's no right or wrong when it comes to editing. You just adjust it to where you like it to be. And yeah, so I think that's pretty good at 70. That's getting pretty bright. I'll probably adjust it further because I want it more like a little more contrasty on the subject and not such emphasis on the background, this strong light source. So now let me just so then moving on from the exposure, I will adjust the contrast. So I just bump it to the right a bit to give it a little more punchy look, but you don't want to go too far because, as mentioned, part of that bright and airy look is kind of having that like soft, dreamy, ethereal look. So I think 25 is pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. From here, we'll be adjusting the highlights, the shadows, the whites, and the blacks. So as mentioned with the highlights, right, bright and airy usually increase the highlights. So I'll just tweak it until I like it. I'm not going to tweak it that much because I already, with the exposure increase, it affects the highlights as well. So I don't need to go too crazy with it. So when it comes to the shadows, as mentioned, you'll be pushing towards the highlights and the whites. But taking a look at the histogram here, it's already fairly pushed. And I kind of want to retain a little darkness in the in her dress and in the shadows in some of the background, just to have that contrast, so it's not just a like a bland white looking image. So I'll probably just increase the shadows by a tiny bit. And then in terms of the whites, I'll bump this up a tad bit as well, just until I like how it looks. And very fine adjustments here. As mentioned earlier, the tone curve and honestly just the basic exposure increase adjustments will probably get like 80 to 90% of that look already you're going for. And the rest of these are just kind of fine tuning and tweaking for that look and kind of your personal style. And then lastly on the blacks, so I am actually going to reduce some of the blacks here just to make it a little more contrasty again. And as you can see, I think it's starting to look better in my personal opinion, because now we adjusted the highlights and the whites, and we kind of are bringing the blacks back down because it was getting a little flat, a little dull. So this is how I like to adjust it. And of course, it's, every photo is different. As mentioned, I'm decreasing this because there's a lot of black in the image. I mean, she's in a black dress, her hair is black. In the background, there's a lot of black in the shade of the trees. So I think that looks pretty good right there for some of the basic edits. You can just already take a look at the before and after, and as you can see, it's already starting to get that bright and airy look. All right, from here, I like to move on to the texture, clarity, and dehaze sliders. So the texture and clarity sliders are great for kind of introducing some more of that kind of soft, dreamy look and not making it so sharp. So when it comes to the texture, I like to always just increase it by like a little bit, like +5 or +10 on all my images. And depending on the photo, how it already looks, I'll decide whether or not I want to increase the clarity or decrease. But in this case, since we're going for that softer look, I'll want to decrease it so it looks a little more like smoothed out, I want to say, or kind of just that more like dreamy, like summer haze look. And one tip I forgot to mention is if you're having trouble deciding on what slider to go with, you can always, adjust it, go extreme opposites to see what it will look like, and then kind of reduce it further from there. So as you can see, I like it more on the left side for that dreamy kind of ethereal look, like you're in a haze. And so I'll be pushing it towards the left, but as you can see, too much is too much. So I'll probably just reduce it like -10, -15. Maybe -10, -15 was a little too much. Let's see. Yeah, probably just -10. But as you can see now, it looks a little more smoothed out. maybe even -5. I might just stick with -5. I just don't want to go too overboard. As you can see, I do very, minor adjustments. I think that's always best. Like, you kind of want, if you're adjusting it too much, I feel like you didn't really capture it in camera as well as you should, because usually when you do it in post-processing, you just want to edit some like minor details. Really, you don't want to go too overboard, and I think that's always a good thing to remember. And if you find yourself editing a lot in these adjustments, then try to capture your intended look in camera a little bit better. I found that the images always look better when I do that. So after the clarity and texture slider is the fifth step, which is the vibrance and saturation. So the vibrance and saturation will just increase the colors and the saturation of the colors in your image. This one's more of a personal taste. Sometimes, depending on my mood, I adjust, vibrance or saturation more or less. But in this case, since we're going for bright and airy, again, you're thinking ethereal, dreamy. So I'm thinking in my mind, more saturation, more color. If you're going for a moody look, right, you would drop the saturation more. And obviously it doesn't look as good with this photo because this is already just like a bright and airy setting, as I mentioned earlier, right? The subject smiling, there's sun. So I want to bump up the colors. So I'll probably, as you can see, like right there, right? If you increase it all the way, then it's very like, it's very punchy. And so I don't want to do it that much. So probably like just plus, I wanted to get it plus like plus 10 probably, and then increase the saturation, maybe like +5. Yeah, I might just leave it at +5, to be honest. I don't want to get it too cartoonish looking. So I also will drop down the vibrance by just a little bit. But as you can see, that it introduced a little more color into the background and just the overall photo. And taking a look at the image from left, before and after, it's looking a lot more bright and airy in the image. And taking a look at this before and after, actually no, that exposure is really good. Yeah, so taking a look at the before and after, you can already see a lot of adjustments to that bright and airy look. So the sixth step now is the color grading. Now this is all dependent on the colors in your image, to be honest. So a big thing with color grading and the colors adjustments is color theory. So the tool I always love to use when I start to work in the color tab is Adobe Color. I like to look here for the complementary and analogous colors. If you don't know about this website, always have it up when you're editing, especially when you get to your colors. And I can dive into a whole, video about color theory, but there's a lot to unpack there. I'll probably have a video on that in the future. But the two main color schemes I like to edit with are complementary and analogous. So complementary are the colors opposite each other of the color wheel. The most famous one is like blue and orange, in a lot of cinematic color grading. I'll probably be using analogous colors because if you take a look at this image, what do you see? You see greens, yellows, oranges, there's a little red in the photo. And so I want to kind of have that cohesive look with some analogous colors. So this kind of, as you can see, this works perfectly. So it'll be, green, yellow, orange, or mostly just green, green, yellow, orange. And so I'll be going for this color scheme. So the great thing here is that you already have that color, or already have that color scheme in the photo. And this is another thing to remember, that, depending on your setting or what you took photos of, you kind of want to already match the colors that's in your image and then work around there. For example, if I really wanted like a blue, red, and purplish look, I could edit those photos in Lightroom, but it'll look very off, or it'll just look unnatural. Now, of course, if you're going for like a creative aesthetic and just something, artsy, creative, then you could go for it. But if you're doing this for like a client photo or a photo in your portfolio that you're trying to attract clients or businesses, right, you'll want to stick with stuff that's natural and not introduce really any colors that were outside of the actual setting. So now that I have the color scheme that I want, first thing I do is I edit in color grading. So now this is just a personal style. I always like to kind of bump the midtones into like the greens, Especially as you can see the background's green. It kind of introduces that cool look. I kind of love movies and stuff that have like a lot of green in them. Like I don't know if you guys have seen Parasite, but that that movie introduces a lot of greens in that movie, and I just kind of love it. In terms of the shadows, a common theme is to put the shadows into like the blues and to get that kind of like cinematic look. When it comes to the highlights, I'm not going to touch the highlights because, especially in this image, if you take a look at where the sun's coming from, the sun's kind of like the main highlights and the whites in this image, and it's on touching her skin a lot. So if I adjust the highlights, it'll be tweaking her skin tone a lot. So for example, like if I push it in the blues or like the greens and the yellows and the oranges, you can see it's changing her skin tone, and I don't really want that. So I'm just not going to touch the highlights. So taking a look at the before and after, you can kind of see we're one step away from kind of calling this finished. So after the color grading, I like to move on to the color sliders. And now the color sliders is all personal choice. Again, there's no right or wrong here. I'll just show you kind of how I'm going to edit this. So as mentioned, right, with the Adobe color wheel, you have to remember what colors you'll want to stick with. So as mentioned, we're going for like green, yellow, orange. So I wouldn't really, do something crazy like bump up like the purples, and then introduce some purples like that. You see how it just starts to look off because it's going away from the colors we wanted. So in terms of this, honestly, the main ones that you'll want to look, especially at this photo, right? Because again, which green, yellows, and oranges are just these ones. And so for example, as you can just see right there, there's some blues in the image. So if I drop down the blues to really highlight the colors we wanted, you can see now it's purely that green, yellow, and orange look. And I think it looks a little better decreasing the saturation because the colors, the color scheme I was going for now is a bit stronger. And so I'll drop the blues a little bit like that. I'll also drop the luminance of the blues. Kind of what I'm looking at here is I just want like a nice kind of like garden look, right? Where the sun's coming in, the greenery, it's going through, the sunlight's flowing through her clothing, and kind of that see-through look. And so, you can make other tweaks here. As again, there's no right or wrong, but you can drop in this image, I could drop the greens down to be more yellowish, and that'll still be fine, right? Because where it still has that yellow look. So I'm gonna actually drop it like a tiny bit because I think that looks good, because now it's adding a little more yellow to kind of show the sunlight. In terms of the yellows, you can drop it down or increase it as well, and it gets more on each side. But again, be careful here and look at their skin tone, because when I dropped it down here, because again the sun's touching her and she has a yellow skin tone, it'll adjust her, and you don't really want that. Same with the oranges. And so pretty much right here, I'm liking how it looks. I didn't have to make crazy changes. I do honestly most of my editing in the color grading here with just these subtle edits, and then it kind of I like how it looks overall like that, and then I'll do like fine adjustments, very fine adjustments here in the color slider. So after the color grading, I like to move into like the filters, the masking, and kind of the other fine effects, like creative effects such as noise. So I like to introduce a little noise or grain into the image. So I like to just, honestly, I tweak, or I just play around with this, see how it looks. Similar to what I mentioned earlier, I like to adjust it like all the way to the right and then see how that'll look. So for example, I'm going to decrease the roughness a little bit. I don't want it to, like the noise, the more grain you add in, that more kind of like vintage film look you get. And that's all personal choice, personal aesthetic. Like I kind of like it with a little more grain. So I think that looks pretty good there. You can zoom in, see how it looks. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good like there. It kind of has that like vintage filmy look now, especially up in the sun. That looks pretty cool. Sun and grain always are like a good pair for that vintage look. So taking a look at the before and after again, as you can see, this was the original photo. This is the after right now. From here, I like to move on to the masking settings in Lightroom. And with the new masking, they automatically select your subject and your background. So What I love to do here is I love to add a little more contrast on the subject, and I'll decrease the background, especially for a portrait like this, where I want the main emphasis, like right when you look at the photo, I want the subject, or I want the viewer to really like see the subject first. So that involves me decreasing some of the exposure in the background and increasing the brightness and contrast on the subject. So I just like to turn off this mask. It's essentially just saying, okay, it highlighted all the background. And then I will drop the exposure just like a tiny bit. You see like right there already, it's, oh, brought the red back. Just that tiny adjustment, as you can see, already made it look like a little better in my opinion, or let the subject stand out a little bit better. So I'll just drop it a tiny bit like that. And then I will adjust the subject. So now let me just hit add, select subject. Now it's on the subject. Let me just turn off the red. Now I'll bump up the contrast on the subject a little bit just to have them stand out a little more. This is where I like to adjust it all the way and then maybe bring it back. I think that's good. Let me try decreasing the blacks a lot to make them stand out even more because she has a black dress. Very fine adjustments, guys, you know. I think -3, honestly. I bumped up the contrast. I think that looks pretty good. I might go back to the background and drop that a little more. I don't want to drop it too much because then I'm getting away from that bright and airy look because we already bumped up the exposure. So I'm just want to do it like, I might honestly, I think 0.10 would look good, -0.10. Yeah, it kind of still has that bright and airy look, but now it has some of the contrast introduced into it again as well. Yeah, so adjusting the, so just to recap, so in the background, when I selected the background, I just reduced the exposure a little bit just to make a little bit more focus on the subject. And then on the subject, I increased the contrast to drive further emphasis on the subject. And that's pretty much it. That's all the 7 steps. We'll take a look at the before and after again. And as you can see, you know, the original photo, as mentioned, lends itself well to a nice photo to be edited with that bright and airy style. And I think that's the biggest thing, honestly, that main takeaway I want you guys to take is that the actual photo straight out of the camera and the setting and everything, that, you know, whether the facial expression of your subject, what the subject is, if it's dark out, if it's sunny out, if the actual setting, like are they in plants, trees, bright sunlight, which is like a happy mood, or is it in a dark setting? Is it in a dark grungy setting? You know, everything lends itself to a particular mood, and you want to really remember this when you're editing your photos, because sometimes, you know, in this photo, for example, I could have tried to edit it moody, but it would have just looked off, right? You gotta align the photo and how it looks along with a certain aesthetic and editing style. So with that being said, I hope you guys liked this video. If you found it helpful, give it a thumbs up and let me know if you guys want me to touch on another editing style in the comments down below. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys next time.